although maybe some of you who are joining this as a public event, which marks the launch of a new research group within the University of Birmingham, the Diversity in STEM and Innovation Research Group. So my name is Stephen Jones. I'm a lecturer at the University of Birmingham and one of the founders of the International Network for the Study of Science and Belief in Society, as well as the lead for the Diversity in STEM and Innovation Research Group. So it falls to me to introduce the event and the speakers. Now, of course, the themes in this panel are not new themes. The questions about exclusion of social groups from science careers, from different kinds of medical technologies, or different kinds of technologies in society have been debated for a very long time. It's not a new subject, but they continue to be worth raising, not only because inequalities remain something, certainly in some countries, a scandal. If you take the UK professoriate, for example, it's made up of 66% white men, only 2% black and minority ethnic women. But it's also because often questions about diversity in the sciences are asked in a somewhat narrow way, I would suggest, with the impact of certain connotations and cultural resonances of the idea of science not always being analysed in a fully rounded or sophisticated way. And I think that's perhaps arguably clearest in the case under discussion on this panel. So we will be talking more specifically about inequality relating to religion. So discussions of science and exclusion and inequality typically pay, in the UK at least, a little, sometimes even no attention to the impact of popular claims about science and religion on equality and representation in the sciences. Here in the UK, it's often seen just not as a subject really worthy of discussion. It was only very recently that we started even collecting data on the representation of different religious groups in the sciences. And that's despite the fact that that data does show that inequalities demonstrably exist between religious groups, and that religious inequalities are very complicatedly linked to racial and ethnic and gender exclusions as well. Now, this is perhaps less so in other contexts, and that's part of the reason why in assembling this panel, a very interesting and enlightening speakers, we wanted to cover a wide geographical terrain. So I'm just going to introduce the speakers we're going to be joined by today very quickly. If you want a more full biography, the event page on the University of Birmingham website has much more detail, but I don't want to spend too much time introducing everyone. So the speakers we have today are Lucy Avramidou, who is an associate professor and Rosalind Franklin Fellow at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, Elizabeth Barnes, who's assistant professor of biology education at Middle Tennessee State University in the United States, apologies, Professor Ramaswamy, it's a visiting professor at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi, and between 2016 and 2018, president of the Indian Academy of Sciences in Bangalore. We have Dr. Hina Shahid, who's chair of the Muslim Doctors Association here in the UK, and I should say is the only one here who is a doctor in the real sense of actually being a doctor, unlike us. And then finally, my colleague, Dr. Carissa Sharp, who's a research fellow at the University of Birmingham in the UK, as well as one of the leads of the Diversity in STEM and Innovation Research Group. So what we're going to do, it's quite a tightly packed schedule. We're going to have each speaker speak in turn for around 10 minutes. I'll try and time that quite strictly because otherwise we won't have enough time for questions at the end, and then we'll bring all the questions together at the end. So if you do have questions for any speakers as we go, please do put them in the chat. I'll try and keep a record as we go along and select either all or the best questions at the end for the panelists. I know not all of the panelists have had the opportunity to discuss the order, so I should say we're going to move in alphabetical order. So we're going to start with Lucy in just a second, then Elizabeth Barnes, Professor Ram Ramaswamy, Hina Shahid, and then finally my colleague Carissa to end. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Lucy and she can begin the discussions. So do you want to take it away?
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks a lot for this invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you today. What I would like to do in the next 10 minutes, I want to share a story. The story is not my own. It's the story of Amina, a woman in physics. Amina told me her story a few years ago during a study in which I conducted into the barriers, difficulties, and conflicts faced by women trying to succeed in physics. The story documents the journey of Amina to becoming a physicist, her persistence and failures, and her sense of never really belonging in physics throughout her study and career. The story also highlights another important issue. Amina is not just a woman physicist. Amina is also a Muslim, a Turkish migrant to Western Europe, a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, and a friend. These many interconnected identities weave together in a unique way to make her who she is. They also position her as an outsider in physics, which has historically been a largely white, male, and atheist field. A little bit about Amina now. Amina was born and raised in Turkey, where she studied physics. During her undergraduate studies, she was only one of two female students in the physics classroom. During her studies, she had just one female instructor. In order to enter the buildings at the university, Amina had to take off her hijab because of a national law that was in effect at that time. In her words, I had to take my scarf off when entering university because it was forbidden. I felt discriminated against. However, it was obvious that I wore a scarf outside. Anyone could recognize from my clothing or even from my undone hair that I was Muslim. I felt oppressed. I felt oppressed, especially as a woman, because nothing ever happens to men. They can enter the building without any problem because they don't wear a hijab. But as a woman wearing a hijab, you can't hide it. I felt and still feel discriminated against because of that. Amina completed her master and PhD in the US in two different states. Quite often, she was confronted with the question of religion. She described an incident when she first met her supervisor. When we first met, he was surprised that I was a physicist. He said, I'm really shocked. How can you be both a physicist and Muslim? All physicists I know are atheists. So this question reveals a tension between two identities that are often perceived as conflicting, being a physicist and being religious. For Amina, this tension or clash made her feel as if she was an outsider in every situation, a common feeling for many with marginalized identities, and especially for women belonging in religious minorities groups. This issue can leave people feeling that they have to erase essentially aspects of who they really are in order to fit in certain places, something that can exacerbate their sense of exclusion and suffering. When I asked Amina about her experiences with living and working in Western Europe, in the Netherlands, she said, I think for most people, religion comes first because of my hijab. It's the first thing that comes to their minds. Oh, she's Muslim. And then they easily stereotype. That's the thing I'm mostly concerned about. It's a feeling that I cannot describe, but I feel like people have less respect for me. And she goes on to talk about her experiences as an instructor. Sometimes I feel that the students don't take me so seriously. They easily stereotype and they ignore me. I have to raise my voice. Why? Because I'm a young woman in a physics department. I'm an immigrant, and on top of that, I am Muslim. I cannot say that it's only the religion, it's all of me. So what we see in this story is essentially a conflict between Amina's desired identities as a woman in science and her assigned negative identities by others, which contain a series of negative stereotypes. A Muslim, an immigrant, essentially an economic refugee, and as someone who should be at home raising family instead of being in the physics laboratory. Amina left her career in academia after 4 years of being a lecturer in Western Europe, ending her physics journey. Did she leave because she's a woman? No. Did she leave just because she's Muslim? No. She left because her intersectional identities continually position her as an outsider in physics. It's only when we realize how the intersection of gender with other marginalized identities causes exclusion that we will be able to address the problem of underrepresentation of women and especially religious minorities in science in general and physics in particular. Thank you.
It's a wonderful introduction to the subject and a very interesting bit of I'm biased because I'm a qualitative sociologist, but excellent qualitative detail of the kinds of issues that we're dealing with in this panel. So I shall pass on then to the next speaker, Elizabeth Barnes, and she is going to talk through the United States case.
So much, and thank you, Lucy, first for that really powerful story. Are you able to see my screen correctly right now? Yes, okay, great. So hi everyone, thanks for being here virtually. It's an honor to be serving as a speaker on this panel. I always have loved this conference, and I'm glad we're able to get together today. So my name is Liz Barnes. I'm an assistant professor of biology, and I run the Social Perceptions of Science lab in the biology department at Middle Tennessee State University. And one major goal of my research lab is to explore the teaching and learning of topics that are really important in biology, but that are controversial in society. And I do that because I want to determine effective ways to teach those topics. And this is really interesting to me being in the field of biology because we have an abundance of science in the field of biology that's really well accepted and seen as robust in the biology community, but is controversial in society, and it's often based on religious identity. So for instance, the most obvious topic that a lot of us are familiar with is evolution. It's literally a core concept of the entire discipline of biology. Something like 95% of biologists recognize that all of life has evolved from a common ancestor. And yet, although it's one of the most supported ideas in biology, about half of the United States public doesn't recognize large-scale evolution as valid. And so that's what got me really interested in studying this topic, this idea that we could have such a robust area of science that has been rejected for almost 150 years since Darwin's book was published, right, by people with a certain identity. But over the last 8 years of studying this, I've realized that attitudes toward these important yet controversial topics, so other examples are like climate change or COVID-19 mitigation, that these are inextricably linked to inclusion and diversity efforts in science education. So first I realized that part of reducing skepticism about evolution as valid science among religious students specifically was really to provide a more welcoming and inclusive environment for them. Because we were doing all of these studies with instructors and students, and it was showing that religious students were feeling stigmatized in biology, and that instructors teaching evolution were either avoiding discussions of religion completely, or actually actively presenting religion as adversarial to evolution. But I know that a lot of people at this conference know that the conflict narrative between religion and science has been oversold. And especially by some evolutionary biologists who a lot of times are secular and can confuse their philosophical stance of atheism with their scientific stance on evolution. So I really started to think about how we can create more inclusive environments for religious students in biology. But also through this research, we started to see how these goals didn't just matter for inclusive teaching, but also mattered for fostering racial and gender diversity in the sciences. So we started to find consistent disparities in evolution acceptance of Black students in our studies, which were of undergraduate biology students in the United States. And so when I started looking in the literature on religiosity of African Americans in the US, there was this clear trend that they tended to have a higher religiosity compared to other groups. And then, so I went back to my data on undergraduate students and found that statistically, the higher religiosity of Black students actually was explaining their lower evolution acceptance levels. And this was really interesting because in the United States, evolutionary biology has a real diversity problem compared to other areas of biology that you don't see as much conflict between religion and evolution. So for instance, only about 1% of PhDs in evolutionary biology go to Black students in the United States. And this is compared to up to 10% of PhDs that are awarded to Black students in other fields of biology. So we really started thinking that if evolutionary biology wanted to be more inclusive of Black students, then they probably needed to create a more welcoming environment for religious students. And it was really during this same time that I started seeing work from other researchers that were confirming these trends. So people were showing that people who were working on the intersectional identities with race and religion among scientists were finding similar trends like Dr. Elaine Eklund. And there was also evidence emerging that religious identity could be impacting gender diversity too, right? So because when we're looking at women in science, women are underrepresented, but specifically Christian women are very underrepresented. There are very few Christian women scientists. So that's one of the biggest voids that we're seeing. So it's not just about inclusion or fostering more positive attitudes towards science, which both are very important endeavors in of themselves, but it's also about helping to foster a more equitable and diverse scientific community. So now, about 8 years after I started doing this research, as I started as an undergrad on how to teach religious students about evolution, I've adopted this twofold goal of my research lab that I've started. So first, we want to know how to avoid what we call identity protective cognition about important controversial science topics. And two, we want to create a more diverse and inclusive scientific community. And based on a bunch of studies that we've done in evolution education, primarily, we landed on this idea of fostering religious cultural competence among scientists to help promote effective science communication and education. So cultural competence is, excuse me, primarily defined as the ability of one cultural group to communicate and work effectively with another cultural group. And it's a really useful framework in this context because it illustrates the importance of bridging the cultural differences between groups. And as I mentioned, in the United States, at least, there's this huge disconnect between the religious backgrounds of scientists and those of the general public. So in the US, 89% of the public says that they believe in God, while only about 25% of American biologists do. And like I said, in our studies, we're showing that instructors are mostly avoiding discussing the conflict narrative and its weaknesses, which is important, or they're actively presenting evolution and religion as necessarily adversarial. So it didn't really seem to us that many biologists, at least at the college level instruction in the United States, had thought very deeply about how to teach religious students about these controversial topics effectively. So we published upwards of like 15 papers on this topic at this point of how to build religious cultural competence in evolution education. I did want to take a minute to share just a few key findings about that. So first, it was really heartening to us that we found that instructors could indeed help reduce perceived conflict between students' religious identity and evolution in different ways. And the easiest way really seemed to simply address the misconception that you have to be an atheist to accept evolution. So in the US, more than half of college biology students think that you have to be an atheist to accept evolution. And this misconception is not just prevalent among religious students, but non-religious students as well. However, when you look at whether or not it's related to their acceptance, that misconception that evolution has to be atheistic only is negatively associated with religious student acceptance of evolution. So when instructors taught about or showed examples of religious scientists who accepted evolution, or if they described the nature of science as answering certain questions different from that of perhaps religion, and explaining science as agnostic rather than atheistic, this really seemed to help increase positive attitudes towards evolution. Another practice we found to help improve student attitudes was not to present evolution as something that must be accepted. So when instructors were what people call dogmatic in their evolution instruction, and students thought that the instructor was saying, like, quote unquote, trying to force them to accept evolution, they ultimately actually accepted it less, which is kind of ironic. So making students feel freedom in forming their opinions seemed to be important. And then, of course, when instructors were being negative about religion, we actually saw that this was negatively impacting their attitudes. So now, as I started my journey as a new assistant professor running my own research lab, I just started last year, and I'm super excited about that and taking this new step forward. I really want to take this foundation in evolution education research and then think about how to reduce conflicts between religious identities and other areas of science, so such as like COVID-19 and COVID-19 mitigation efforts. I've gathered some exploratory data in this area, which so far are showing a need for religious cultural competence in COVID-19. And importantly, we're also finding those similar racial, ethnic, and gender differences for COVID-19 attitudes as we have been seeing for evolution attitudes. All right, so that's just about all the time that I have, but I just want to thank everybody so much for having me. It's, like I said, it's such an honor to be on this panel, and I'm really looking forward to hearing questions that folks have.
Again, thank you, Elizabeth. That's a fascinating introduction to a very important topic. So we're going to keep keep on with the alphabetical approach that we're taking. So I'm going to move on to Professor Ramaswamy now, who's going to talk a bit more about the Indian context, I understand.
Okay. Thank you for having me, Stephen. You had muted me and I had neglected to unmute myself.
Apologies.
All right. I said I'm very pleased to be at this meeting, although, of course, I'm not a sociologist and I bring a different perspective. Just to get things going, because India is really very different from other countries in many different ways. One of the important distinctions in India is that we have a very diverse religious composition, 80% of the population being Hindu, 14% Muslim, 6% Christian, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, and a host of other religions. And of course, all these numbers have to be multiplied by 1.3 billion. So we are talking about a lot of people. And many Indian belief systems, religions, if you like, have traditional learning. They have a long tradition of this, many theories of the origin of life and evolution and so on and so forth. So it's in this context that I would just like to, have a few more slides than I need to have. I just want to point out that India is one of the very few countries where in the constitution, it is declared to be a sovereign socialist, secular democratic republic, and secular in the sense of being, separating church from state and so on. Our constitution actually states explicitly that it's the duty of every citizen of India to develop a scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform. I mean, this is relevant because as recently as yesterday, the Dalai Lama mentioned that he appreciates the Indian concept of secular values, not dependent on religion. This distinction between, bringing religion into all aspects of life has not been respected in recent years. And there are public assertions from leading politicians these days that ancient Indian tradition, specifically Hindu tradition, was aware of many aspects of modern science. As recently as 2014, it was said in a very public forum, drawing upon mythological references, there was a claim that cosmetic surgery and reproductive genetics were practiced thousands of years ago in India. The point being that we can feel proud of what our country achieved in medical science at least in one point of time, if not now. The point that Dr. Barnes was making on evolution, a couple of years ago, our Minister for Higher Education actually demanded that the theory of evolution should be removed from school curricula. Not because he believed or didn't believe in it, but because he asserted that Darwin is scientifically wrong. It needs to change in the school and college curriculum. Since man has been seen on earth, he's always been a man. Nobody, including our ancestors, in writing or in, I mean, the English is a little dodgy, said that they ever saw an ape turning into a human being. Now, this is such a preposterous misunderstanding of the theory of evolution that the Science Academies of India actually issued a public statement saying that there was no scientific basis for the minister's statements. And then we went on to say a few other things. The point is, of course, that when in public life such things happen, it's a very bad mix of nationalism and science. And this is germane to today's discussion because nationalism and religious identity are strongly intertwined in modern India. As I already pointed out, 80% of our population is Hindu and every other religion is a minority. The sociologist Meera Nanda actually said in an article in 2016 that there is a lethal mixture of desire, envy, and a sense of innate superiority, Aryan superiority, that has characterized India's encounter with modern science and technology. Okay. Uh, in day-to-day practice, the roles of religion and culture in India are almost indistinguishable. It's not uncommon to see religious and caste identities displayed on very prominent scientists, many of whom are religious and observant of rituals and ceremonies of religious practice, especially at marriages, births, and deaths. Rennie Thomas pointed out that while scientists may term themselves atheist, they don't find any contradiction in keeping the lifestyle of a religion, religious taboos, dietary taboos, fasting at Ramadan, for example, not eating certain kinds of food, and so on and so forth. Uh, this is not even a thing. At the same time, public science, big public science, is accompanied by very public displays of religious practice. What I've done over here is to show you the hands of the head of the Indian Space Research Organization visiting a temple to offer prayers to a very powerful temple deity. And there is no inconsistency that is felt in such positions. Um, Similarly, many scientists will promote alternative and traditional medical systems as being equally valid as modern medicine. All this has an impact, especially because science is so important in our current lives. And the last comment is really about, alternative medicine for COVID-19. Uh, okay. Much of Indian science is dominated by an upper caste Hindu male elite. As Stephen, as you pointed out, this is even more extreme than the UK. It's not 60%, it is virtually 80%. We have legislated social diversity by reservation policies, but these are not easy to overcome because the initial conditions are so, they're just so inappropriate to a life in science. So in a scientific career, representation gets more and more skewed, especially when it comes to recognition and positions of leadership. So I have some numbers for the Indian Academy of Science. For example, we have 1,000 fellows. Of these 1,000 fellows, there are only 100 women. Okay, so the gender imbalance is extreme. If you go outside Hindu the religious community, there are fewer than 100. And this corresponds to 20% of the population. So again, and 100 is an overestimate. There's probably a factor of 4 in this count. And beyond religion, if you go to the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, these are the socially marginal groups, which comprise about 25% of the population. uh, the numbers are even smaller, and these are technically not Hindu and should not even be counted in that group. So, an appreciation of religious diversity and representation of this religious diversity in public science is really not there. And what I've shown on the right are books that try to illustrate the contributions of different caste groups to scientific practice. At the same time, bringing disadvantaged groups into the mainstream has been an objective of science academies. And since the year 2000 or so, gender equality has been promoted, and leading up to a book that I co-edited on the women scientists of India. But still, even after so many years or 20 years of efforts, the numbers have not increased to the level which would be satisfactory. There are no comparable efforts to increase representation of other minorities in the sciences. Even though many educational institutions are governed by religious organizations, usually charities, both Hindu and non-Hindu, higher education in the sciences is not a priority given the situation. Some minority institutions, for example, have instruction in Urdu or in some language in which scientific education may or may not be possible. So this intersection of religion, language, and and sort of it makes it very difficult to to intervene. I just want to briefly describe an effort for inclusive STEM education, where students are given an opportunity to do science research in the summer. About 2,000 students are encouraged. And what we saw was that the bulk of students, that is the green parts, come from the areas that you can see on this map of India. Whereas the orange parts, which are the areas of deprivation, really correspond to places where there are tribals, socially excluded groups, economically marginal groups, and so on. There are a lot of minorities in these areas. In Jammu and Kashmir, a lot of Muslims and so on, right? It's not nearly as simple as that, but I'm just very briefly describing the problem over here. So one thing that we tried to do to enhance the spread of science in these areas was to have just targeted a sort of a reservation policy within this fellowship, giving students regions without specifying what their background should be. But hopefully, if you target a region, you get more than an average amount of people from different religions and different social groups and so on and so forth. I should just say that, there's these initiatives have taken off, but the pandemic has actually put paid to many of these efforts in the last year. But I'm hopeful that we should be able to get more and more disadvantaged and excluded groups into science and science education, because the earlier you get them into the science education pattern, the more successful they will be as time goes on. Okay, uh, to summarize, there has been a serious attempt in India to make science and higher education more accessible to more diverse communities in the population. This does not happen easily without special schemes to promote inclusion, either through legislation or through informal grassroots schemes such as what I have described here. Uh, I think we all believe that increased diversity is valuable, not only because it's more representative, but also because there is value in the input of different experiences, and other speakers have said the same thing in slightly different ways. And it is increasingly appreciated that this correlates directly with innovation. But more than innovation and being representative, it is also a just practice to do this. Let me just conclude by saying that there is this concept of epistemic injustice identified by the philosopher Miranda Fricker, uh, namely the wrong that is being done to somebody in their capacity as knower. And especially people from different religious groups, different social groups, and minority groups, they face this kind of injustice. Lucy talked about it, and as did Dr. Barnes, that when you see a person in a hijab, or when you see somebody wearing a caste mark, or wearing, proclaiming their religious identity, there is a bias, and people assign a lower value of credibility to such speakers. Um, at the same time, these people, people from different groups also suffer a different kind of injustice, because their experiences are not valid in the majority, in the mainstream. And such injustices are things that we should do away with. And inclusivity of not only religion, but also different social groups is extremely important in this context. And with that, let me thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ram. That's been a really illuminating discussion. And I think it's really useful getting the different country contexts, set aside one another just because it really shows the differences between different countries. So I'm going to move on and invite Dr. Hina Shahid to give her short talk as well. So please do take it away, Hina.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's been really interesting listening to all the speakers and reflecting on how many commonalities we have within our different spheres of work. And just to say that we are all doctors, proper doctors here. So I'm going to be talking about the intersectional approaches to diversity and Islamophobia in medicine. So I am a family physician working in London and also chair of the Muslim Doctors Association. So what do we know about the medical workforce in the UK? So we know that just under 50% are female, just under 50% or 46% are from an ethnic minority background, and roughly 10% of the medical workforce is from a Muslim background. So this is data from the General Medical Council, which is our regulatory body. So this is about 10 years old. And what it shows is that if you are from an ethnic minority background, you're more likely to have complaints against you from patients, from employers. You're more likely to have those complaints investigated. And when those complaints are investigated, you're more likely to be put under higher sanctions and warning or restrictions to your practice. But sadly, this hasn't changed 10 years on. So we know that if you are from an ethnic minority as a doctor, you're still almost twice as likely to be disciplined than your white counterparts. Also, ethnic minority doctors are 4 times more likely to fail the clinical GP or family medicine exam. Where ethnic minority well-being is negatively affected, research shows that this actually does impact quality of care given to patients and also patient satisfaction. And importantly, we know that non-UK trained doctors, so what we call IMG or international medical graduates, are 2 to 3 times more likely to be erased or suspended from the medical register, which means that they are no longer allowed to work following a complaint and investigation. So what we know is that racism is sustained by the system and culture within the National Health Service. So in the UK, we do have a publicly funded health service, the NHS. And we know that in particular, trainee doctors are reluctant to complain when they do encounter issues around discrimination, unfair treatment. There is a widely held view that problems encountered by trainees from an ethnic minority background are due to reasons such as not understanding the English culture. And this leads to silence and racial fatigue because they are tired of having to speak about the injustices and discrimination that they face. But what we also know is that this discrimination starts early on, whilst they are students with negative stereotypes, poorer learning experience, and also underperformance compared to their peers. So that's about ethnicity, but why do we need to discuss religious discrimination? So in September 2017, the Social Mobility Commission report concluded that Muslims were being held back in the workplace by widespread Islamophobia, racism, and discrimination. And the report went on to list barriers to success, including negative stereotypes about Muslims, a lack of Muslim staff or role models, bullying and harassment. And in particular, the report revealed that women wearing headscarves faced particular discrimination in the workplace. And so they came up with this concept of the triple penalty, so that if you are female, if you are visibly Muslim, and if you are from an ethnic minority, that you face particular disadvantage in the workplace. So what about the NHS? Now, in the NHS, we know from a very large study on tens of thousands of staff that was conducted by the King's Fund, an independent think tank, that people from all religions experience discrimination on the basis of their faith. But this is by far the highest among Muslims. And what we also know, looking at figures around leadership and representation, is that only 2% of senior management and leadership roles are held by Muslims. So there was a small survey conducted last year by the Huffington Post and the British Islamic Medical Association, and they asked doctors whether they had experienced Islamophobia at work, and 81% said that they had. And this is some work that we carried out in 2018. So case studies from junior doctors working in the NHS around their experiences of discrimination. So quotes like, "You can't wear that thing in theatre," said the consultant while pointing at my headscarf in front of the nurses and the registrar. The registrar, a senior colleague, would bleep me several times on purpose after I told him I was going to pray and be back in 10 minutes. And when I'd return, I'd see him laughing and say, "That was a long prayer. Didn't God tell you that you have jobs to do?" And then experiences of a doctor who was working in sexual health and the stereotypes that she faced, and questions like, "Are you sure you're okay with this job?" And the response that she got was, "You look quite religious. You may see things that make you quite uncomfortable. We have a non-judgmental approach here." So really quite deep assumptions. And then this one by a pediatric doctor, who said that although I have rarely experienced overt prejudice, mine is more subtle. It's the assumption through the questions from others that I don't speak English. It's the lack of friendliness during induction in new jobs where I don't know anyone. It's the assumption that I don't know the system, or that I'm new to the UK, or that I'm not in a training program. It's the assumption that I will not be able to do my job well, and the constant having to prove myself with each new rotation. It's the eye rolling from the nurses and seniors when asking questions. It's a surprise reaction that I actually am a normal human being who is relatively competent at her job with outside interests and hobbies. And this does form part of the wider public perceptions of Muslims in the UK, where almost 70% think that Islam encourages repression of women, and that wearing a headscarf, a hijab, is seen as a symbol of oppression. And we also know from data that anti-Muslim hate crimes are on the rise year on year. Almost 40 incidents occur daily, and women are the main victims. And we have this definition of Islamophobia that's been put forward by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims that has been adopted with varying success around the country, which goes on to say that Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. And so from the research that we've done on Muslim doctors in the NHS and their experiences at work, we found that religious discrimination is prevalent against Muslim doctors from both patients and colleagues, and may also affect fitness to practice decisions. So, as I've mentioned previously, negative stereotypes and prejudice, experiences of intimidation, harassment, and bullying, like the quote that I mentioned with the bleep and the prayer, and that this affects teamwork and relationship with colleagues and supervisors, the feeling of not being accepted, being excluded, outsiders. It leads to stress, impact on well-being and mental health, and that this is not just unconscious bias, but it's institutional across the whole system, including in policies such as dress codes, which have been shown to negatively or to put off women from pursuing careers in surgery. And there's a lack of support for doctors who do experience religious discrimination. And this professional religious identity conflict that was already mentioned by one of the panelists before around evolution, we also do see this in medicine, in particular around decisions to do with end-of-life care or assisted reproduction amongst and assisted physician-assisted dying, which is a big area at the moment that's being explored. But also there is complementarity between professional and religious identities, which don't get the same level of awareness. And we see that this is consistent with the triple penalty that is observed in other professions, as I mentioned in the 2017 report, but it actually goes beyond, and we see this intersectionality where there's overlapping marginalization and multiple disadvantages. So that if you are a doctor who's female, and you're also visibly Muslim, and you're an ethnic minority background, and you've trained abroad, and you're junior in your rank, and you're Black and disabled, each of these add extra layers of barriers and penalties at work, where there's a feeling of lack of support and lack of belonging, and less likely to raise concerns. So these are just a few recommendations about improving the culture in the system in the NHS in response to religious discrimination. So we do need to begin by better data collection and publication in religion. In the UK, we have the Equality Act that lists 9 protected characteristics, of which religion is one. And what we do know from data on doctors is that religion is the most undisclosed protected characteristic. People are fearful of disclosing their religious identity out of fear that they may be discriminated when it comes to job applications. And other recommendations around further studies, training, zero tolerance policy, intersectional EDI impact assessments, improved representation, safeguards to report concerns, psychospiritual support that is faith and culturally sensitive, and faith networks training, mentoring, and leadership support. Thank you.
Wonderful. Again, a really insightful talk, one I know the context of a little better than the others, but still I learned a lot listening to that. So I shall pass over to the final speaker of the session, Dr. Carissa Sharp, who's going to talk a bit more about religious diversity in science. So please take it away, Carissa.
Is this showing the right screen now?
It is indeed, you have the right one.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so as Stephen said, I'm going to be talking about religious diversity in science, and specifically some insights from the Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum project. Most of what I'm going to be talking about in terms of our data comes from the UK, but we have been doing research more globally at this point as well. And I will just say as well, it's very interesting going last in this lineup of speakers because I've been seeing lots of links between the research that we've all been doing. So apologies if any of it seems like a bit of a rehash, but I think it's very interesting that we all seem to kind of be converging on similar themes. So just to, sorry, it's not seeming to want to, there we go, sorry. Okay, so just to kind of outline the problem a bit, I'm going to be focusing on the lack of religious diversity in STEM specifically. And in the majority of country contexts that have been studied, scientists tend to be less religious than the general public. So for example, some data from 2014 says that in the UK, 40% of the general public are religious, but only 27% of scientists are, so there's a real mismatch here. And just to outline some reasons why this is important, you have several different cases for this. You have a business case, which is that diversity makes science better. You have different perspectives, you have a widened focus, but currently we have a lack of people with various demographics engaging with STEM. You have a social justice case, which is that it's unfair to exclude certain voices from STEM, to not reflect the diversity of our societies, and to not extend the opportunities of being involved in STEM to people of all identities. And then finally, you have a public understanding of science case, which is that increasing diversity in STEM will hopefully increase engagement with an investment in science for everyone. So there are several potential explanations for underrepresentation that I want to discuss today. So the first of which is religious people see a conflict between science and religion, and this is the reason for their underrepresentation in science. And what we can say from the research that we've done in many countries to date is that this just isn't true. Across the board, we find that religious people, on average, see compatibility between science and religion. So this doesn't seem to be a good explanation on its own for why there is underrepresentation of religious people in science. The second potential explanation is that religious people see identifying as both religious and a scientist as a surprising or counter-stereotypical combination of identities, that there's something about those identities that don't go together well. I'm not going to go into detail about this either. We do have a publication that's coming out imminently that will go into this in great detail, but suffice it to say, that's not true either. Religious people in general do not see identifying as both religious and a scientist as surprising or counter-stereotypical. So this leaves us with the third potential explanation for underrepresentation, which is that the culture of science discourages religious individuals. And I'm going to talk about three different areas within this, looking at the culture of science. I'll talk about stereotypes, role models, and a sense of belongingness. So first of all, regarding stereotypes, there's research showing that religious individuals are stereotyped as being less intelligent and less competent at science. There's some really fantastic research by Kim Rios and her colleagues looking at the effects of these stereotypes. And they've found that these stereotypes have real important effects on specifically Christians' performance on science-related tasks. That's the population that they were looking at. And I won't go into that in great detail now, but I will point you towards Kim's podcast for the Science and Belief in Society podcast, which goes into that in a lot more depth and is a really fantastic listen. So another aspect of the culture of science that I want to discuss is that of role models. So we did a study where we asked people to list all of the atheist scientists that they could think of and all of the religious scientists that they could think of. And here are the top atheist scientists in terms of the number of times they were written down. You have people like Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, Brian Cox. These are all modern day scientists. When we asked people to list religious scientists, these were all historical. So you have people like Newton, Galileo, and Bacon. So there's a real kind of disconnect in terms of there being current modern religious scientists, role models for religious individuals in the sciences. I will also note when speaking of intersectionality, all of these top 8 scientists listed are obviously white men. So again, this speaks to issues of intersectionality here, but I'm not going to go into greater detail about that now. So finally, on the subject of belongingness, I'd like to point to some really interesting sociological data first. So some really interesting research by Elaine Eklund on elite scientists has found that the majority of elite scientists interviewed actually did not see science and religion as being in conflict, but a larger percentage of them thought that their colleagues were not positive towards religion. So this indicates that the culture of science may be hostile towards religion, even when individual scientists aren't. And Rebecca Cato, who is one of the members of the Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum project, has done some really interesting research on scientific workplaces as well, finding that being non-religious was the assumed norm and any religiosity regarded as somewhat suspicious and odd to be carefully managed in order not to interfere with scientific credibility. So I'd like to follow up this research with 2 studies on belongingness that we did as part of the SRES project. I'll be very brief. The first of these has to do with respect. So we compared how participants thought scientists with particular identities, so religious scientists compared to atheist scientists, were well respected by other scientists, so their peers. And what we found was that all participants, independent of their religious or non-religious identity, viewed religious scientists as being less respected by other scientists than atheist scientists were. So there's this perception that religious people in the sciences are not going to be respected by their peers, which indicates obviously a sense of a lack of belongingness for religious individuals in science. Additionally, we did a study where we looked at the effects of anti-religious statements. So we had people read statements by Richard Dawkins, so these were more or less confrontational, that were anti-religious, so making the case against religion from the perspective of a scientist. And what we found was that religious individuals who read a more confrontational statement, it didn't affect their religious identity or their level of religiosity. What it did was lower their personal identification with science. So religious individuals who read this more confrontational statement were subsequently lower in personal identification with science than those who read a less confrontational statement. So these kind of hostile anti-religious statements are relatively common. When, Richard Dawkins is quite a famous figure, for example. These statements are kind of, and this viewpoint is out in the world around us. And so we can see that these might have negative effects on religious individuals when entering the sciences. So I'll just conclude by briefly discussing the encouragement of religious diversity in science. So what is it that we need to do here? And it seems that that one of the things we need to focus on is the culture of science. So how to make science a more welcoming environment for religious individuals. And one of the things that we can do here is look at related areas of study. So for example, there's been a lot of research looking at the underrepresentation of women in STEM. So we can look at things like interventions that have been developed in that area for ideas. And then as well, linking into the talks before this as well, we need to think about this in an intersectional way. I've been focusing on religious diversity because that was the project that we were doing. But again, we really need to look at the intersection of these different kinds of identities, things like gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, which have their own implications for underrepresentation in STEM, and the ways in which these identities intersect. So thank you very much. Stephen, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Carissa. That's once again a really illuminating 10 minutes of talking, and many, many thanks to all the panelists, not least because I didn't have to bring you to order at all when it came to time, which is a rarity and a pleasure. Okay, so I can't see any questions in the chat as things stand. I think if we have the setup for this, this webinar correctly, anyone who is attending should be able to post questions, but do inform me, anyone who can, if that's not the case. So if anyone wants to post questions or raise hands or anything along those lines, I'm happy to take questions, or I can offer a couple of questions that I've jotted down myself as we were going. So I don't see anything popping up right now. So perhaps if we start off, because we have about 15-20 minutes in which to develop questions, I wondered if I could talk a bit about, I guess this is a question that's to more than one panelist, not necessarily coming into the same way to each panelist though, because some people spoke a bit about recommendations and changes, but I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what kinds of policy changes are currently in place to try and address some of the issues we've raised. I know, Ram, for example, you spoke a bit already about reservation policies and so on, but I wonder if we could, if there are any kind of perhaps initiatives or issues that are currently in the public domain that might try and deal with some of the problems that have been ably expressed over the course of these presentations. So perhaps Lucy, if you know of any in your context, for example, or Hina, if I know you mentioned a few recommendations at the end of yours, but are there any steps being taken by the NHS or other bodies? So does anyone want to take that question on at all, or give any suggestions, thoughts, etc.? Yeah.
So Stephen, let me just, because my context is so India specific, let me just, oops, I would have to get a phone call at this time, wouldn't I? All right. You see, people are uncomfortable, just going on what Carissa was saying, people are very uncomfortable in disclosing religious identity, even, while making applications for various positions or, for scholarships or what have you. Religion is not usually, at least in India, not considered an important parameter, or at least a disclosable parameter or a relevant one. So one of the things that we do have in India are these different kinds of minority institutions, institutions that are governed by Christians, for example, or by Muslims, or by other religions as well. And one of the things that happens in such places is that, science gets devalued. Sometimes because it is in conflict with religious practice and teaching, sometimes because it's more important to, because they're also socioeconomically depressed most of the time. That's why you have these restricted things. So one of the things that needs to be done in some sense is to emphasize the importance of science to all, community leaders, and expect them to take, or request them, or encourage them to take the lead in this regard, because in addition to having role models, people who are religious also tend to listen to religious leaders. So emphasizing science to that through that route might be one thing that is worth trying.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone else want to add anything to that question, or come at the same question from a different perspective or angle at all?
I can say something about the NHS.
Sure, that would be great. Yes.
So, I mean, I mentioned a few recommendations, and there is some work that is being done. So, for example, as I mentioned, and several other colleagues mentioned here, in general, doctors, as well as other scientists, don't like to declare their religion when applying for jobs, for example. And even if we look at the data that's held in NHS trusts and the General Medical Council, and the BMA, which is our kind of union body, it's the least declared protected characteristic. But there are campaigns now to encourage people to declare their religious identity, and there's a real effort now to do that. So hopefully we should be seeing that improve. But also what's interesting is that the General Medical Council is now going to be looking at ways of improving diversity in a more intersectional way. And so whereas we used to have these kind of forums for ethnic minorities, we now have EDI forums that span across protected characteristics. So actually looking at the issue of diversity and inclusion from an intersectional lens, which I think is really positive. And we are also seeing now greater awareness around people's cultural and faith-specific needs in the NHS. So you might have seen some of the recent campaigns around Ramadan, supporting healthcare workers and other workers as well in the NHS, because it's not just healthcare workers that make that up. So we are seeing a lot of positive work that's being done. And I think part of that is because we're speaking more about the issues that have gone brushed under the carpet for so many years, and it's stimulating positive change.
Thanks, that's a wonderful answer, and it's good to know that there are things, because when you talk about the subject, it can get very depressing because it's talking all about the problems, but it's good to know there's some good things coming out as well. Are there any other comments or contributions that panelists want to make?
Yeah, I can share a few things about the Netherlands, because I didn't share any numbers during my 10 minutes. So in terms of numbers, so you started, Stephen, by saying that the UK is sharing some really depressing numbers about the UK, especially in terms of full professors or Black women at the university. And I want to say that the Netherlands is just about the same, with the difference is that we don't talk about it yet. So despite the fact that the country is has become increasingly diverse and very multicultural context, it has only recently, and by recently I mean the last 5 years, that has paid explicit attentions to issues related to diversity and inclusion. And it's only in the last year that the word intersectionality started to be heard in circles of diversity and policy officers, for example. In terms of numbers, yeah, the numbers are pretty depressing in the Netherlands as well. We're only very recently touching upon issues of race, and not even with the use of the word race. So in terms of religion, we're very, very far from addressing issues related to the inclusion of religious minorities in academia, especially. In terms of policies, I think there is a series of policies and strategies that are being implemented to promote gender equality from a very monolithic approach, not an intersectional approach. For example, I'm a Rosalind Franklin Fellow, and this is one of the approaches that was implemented to attract more women in the sciences. The issue, though, and now there is a new policy implemented to raise the percentage of full professors women in the Netherlands, which is right now about 18%. And these are mostly white Dutch women. The problem, though, and I want to connect this with what Carissa said about perhaps looking at what has been done in terms of interventions to promote women in STEM. And I have a very different opinion, because I tend to criticize this intervention because these interventions for a long time focus their attention on fixing the women or supporting women to make their way into this unwelcoming context, instead of reshaping or redesigning this context to be more welcoming than, to women. So yeah, in a way, I feel that these kind of strategies and intervention kind of put the blame on the women, or depart from the assumption that what needs to be fixed are the women and not the context or the institutions where we work. Not to imply that there is no value in looking at these interventions, of course. I mean, there is long evidence in the past 20 years that there are specific interventions, especially around role modeling, that work very well. But I think there is something wrong about the premise of these interventions, focusing on the self instead of the environment, which is essentially the root of the problem.
That's a very good point, that we should make sure that, I mean, not all interventions are the same, are they? Yeah, so being very careful about kind of what we, which aspects we look towards in terms of what is useful. Yeah. Yeah, it's very
Can I
good point.
dovetail off that just for a minute, because I think this is such an interesting conversation that you two are having about this, and one that I've personally thought about a lot when I'm thinking about how do I want to try to institute change as a researcher, right? And I've gone between this, I have intervention studies that I've done, and I also just try to change the culture of biology through my research, and I've landed on that we have to do both. And my reasoning is, one, in order to sustain long-term change and not put it on the person, we have to change the environment for them, right? But also that takes a long time. Like cultural change takes a while, and we have women that are in science right now. And I want to offer them strategies that they can use and that can be useful now for helping them in the current environment we have before we're able to make those changes that we want.
Thanks. That's some very excellent, important points. Lots of nods. I don't know if everyone can see the nods and the thumbs up, but I think we're all pretty much in agreement. I've had a couple of hands raised amongst those attending, but both the hands that were raised have disappeared again. So if you still have a hand to raise, then please do raise it again, and I can call upon you. Aha, we have so Prem Kumara, I think. Hang on, I have to allow you to talk, and you've disappeared again. So I'm just going to see if I can. Here we are. So Prem, I'm just going to allow you to talk now. I only put the hand up again, and oh dear. See, the problem I'm having is that the hands seem to go up and then they come to the top of my list and then they disappear again. So Prema, there we are. Thank you very much. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Can you hear me? Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
All right. I think very, very interesting presentations. I really enjoyed that. And also we see by bringing a kind of a medical terms here, we know we can clearly diagnose the issue, right? Issues are there, problems we have identified, and also some extent we have actually given a kind of a solution, and also sort of an intervention here we discuss and so on. But still I see actually we don't, maybe I don't know, maybe we have not properly diagnosed the issue yet, because the issue is deeper than what we think. I don't know, because now these whole issues, actually ethnic stereotyping, gender stereotyping, the all kind of exclusion, but these are very, very common issues that pop up in this modern world. You see now any forum, any discussions you go, these issues are really pop up. I don't know, because I have a bit of a I have to really think loudly, because how maybe if you don't diagnose it properly, then you won't be able to get the good answer for that, right? Maybe I don't know, because the issues are deeper than what we think. think of. That's what I'm really thinking, because these are, these are not new issues that we have been discussing, right? So I have one particular questions to actually Dr. Ram. Now in India, because after looking at all your statistics, basically you see now women participation in science community is so very, very less. I think it's very interesting to compare with the Sri Lankan case. Sri Lanka is a bit of a different, because if you look at some of the scientific bodies in Sri Lanka, there you see like National Science Foundation, then the National Center for Advance of Science, and so on. So there are, if you look at the past 5-6 years, there are a lot of actually women basically holding big positions like chairperson and all kind of stuff, and women engagement in science actually very much open, but that doesn't say that there's a gender discrimination and so on. But in that sense, I don't know, maybe if I look at this minority participation in the Indian scientific community, but Dr. Abdul Kalam would be a kind of exceptional in that sense.
True. Yeah, of course, there are the exceptions are there, and even today, among my own PhD students, there is a fair amount of representation. My point was more that when you look at statistics over the country, the participation of different religious minorities is much lower than is desirable. Not just lower than expected, but it is really lower than what would be good for the country and for all the communities involved. So, of course, it's very important that Dr. Abdul Kalam was there, and he was iconic. And for for others on the panel, he was the president of India at some point in time. So, to have a prominent Muslim scientist as the president was a very important. He was a technocrat, but it's not split too many hairs. But it was important that we have figures like this, which is also why it is important that we shouldn't have people going around saying that ancient India knew everything.
Thanks. It's a very good answer to a question. We're running a little short of time, and I have one more question in the chat, which I think is quite a good question and is a nice one to end on, because it's the kind of thing that might challenge the various panelists in different ways. And the question goes, forgive me if I get the pronunciation of the name wrong here, from Nuril Munfarida. And the question is, as the researchers in this area, do you have any idea what we can do to bring together religious identity and science in a good way? Because there are some people who don't want to mix between those two things. For example, some teachers avoid bringing controversial issues into the class, especially in religious schools. So the sort of issues that Elizabeth was talking about earlier. So does anyone have any comments about how, if exclusion from science is a problem, how it might be brought in or included in a way that's appropriate or helpful to the people involved?
Yeah, so I think, as simple as it sounds, one of the easiest things in our research that we're finding, as I said before, is showing examples of people who are religious scientists who accept evolution or are pro-science in a lot of ways, or in any other of the areas that people are studying where we have this diversity issue with religious individuals. And also being really clear about, what science does for us, which is not tell us whether or not God exists. This is also another really big misconception. Although people see their religion and science, religious individuals tend to see religion and science as compatible in most areas. There are some of these areas where there are prevalent misconceptions, right? About you have to be an atheist to accept evolution, that religious people aren't really scientists. And just addressing that, I think, is a positive way to bring those two together. Now, talking about teachers avoid bringing controversial issues in the class, at least in the context of the United States, we see the opposite. We see that it's in the public universities that college instructors, I study things at the college level, college instructors do not want to bring in religion, and they're mostly secular instructors. At religious institutions, actually, at Christian institutions, we have a study on this where we interviewed Christian university evolution instructors, and they actually were using all sorts of strategies to try to help students bridge their religion and evolution. And they said it was because of their own experience of learning evolution in the past that they did it.
Those are very good answers. Does anyone else want to add anything to that at all before we close up? Okay, I think that's, I'll take that as a no, and that the answer has been well addressed. So I guess it just falls for me to say, firstly, thank you to everyone who's attended. Thank you to all for coming. This has been a really, really enlightening discussion. I've enjoyed it immensely. And thanks especially to all the panelists, Lucy, Ram, Elizabeth, Carissa, and Hina, for agreeing to take part and for adding to it. So for those who are joining us in the conference, I do believe the next session starts around, I'm going from British Standard Time, UTC +1 here for those not in the UK, 16:45 or 4:45 p.m. To those who are just joining us for the public event, I hope you got something out of it and enjoyed it, and very best for the rest of the day. And thanks again to everyone who's taken part.